5,000 men, plus their wives and children, had gathered in John chapter 6 to hear Jesus preach the words of life. And Jesus saw their need, not only their spiritual need, but he also saw their physical need. The people were hungry. They needed food. One little boy brought 5 loaves and 2 fishes, barely enough to sustain a young child for the day. But Jesus was able to multiply that offering to provide sufficient food, more than enough to feed the multitude. It was a great miracle in John chapter 6, and many preachers quit preaching at that point. But that miracle, the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6, led to a confrontation toward the end of the chapter. When the people began to follow Jesus merely for the free food, Jesus had to have a difficult conversation with them. And at the end of that difficult conversation, the Bible tells us that most of the people left and they never followed him again. They followed him no more. As everybody departed, the crowds left. Jesus sat there rejected and dejected. He looked at his 12 apostles and he said, "Will you also go away?" And Peter said, "Lord, you give us the words of life. Where else shall we go?" And Jesus said, "Have I not chosen out of you 12, and one of you is a devil?" How do you think Jesus felt in that moment? Think about the rejection. Think about the loneliness. And knowing that Judas Iscariot would betray him, the betrayal. Think about that. How do you think Jesus felt when he was arrested, when he was mocked before the Sanhedrin, when he was being spit upon by the very people he came to save? How did he feel as the Romans tortured him and as they mocked him, as they struck him before they took him to the cross and crucified him? The book of Hebrews was written to people who were enduring intense persecution and untold hardship. And in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, the point is made that the suffering that we go through in this life was experienced by Jesus Christ himself, and the point will be made as to why that means we can trust him all the more. This is the next part in our series in the book of Hebrews. The title of today's episode, Jesus, the Great High Priest. In the book of Hebrews, Jewish Christians are beginning to abandon the faith and are going back into Judaism. And they did this to lessen the burden of their persecution. They felt that they could alleviate some of their suffering by going back into Judaism. The Romans persecuted all Jews. They didn't care if you were a Jewish Christian or if you were Judaistic or if you were non-religious. The simple fact that you were Jewish led to your persecution in the Roman Empire. But the Jewish Christians endured Roman persecution as much as their compatriots did. But they also endured persecution at the hands of other Jews. The other Jews not only shunned the Jewish Christians for believing in Christ, but they believed that they were doing God's will by stamping out what they saw as a heretical religion. So in an effort to rebuild bridges in their community, Jewish Christians began to participate in Judaistic worship once again, and in some cases, fully embracing the old religion at the expense of their faith in Christ. The writer of the book of Hebrews argues that this will leave the Jewish Christians hopeless. He points out that the Old Testament religion laid the foundation for Christ and looked forward to his arrival. And since Christ came, there was no need for the Old Testament religion anymore. He continued by saying that by reverting back to the Old Testament religion, the Jewish Christians were abandoning the gospel and going back to an inferior set of practices. At the end of Hebrews chapter 4 and through most of the book of Hebrews chapter 5, the writer begins to shift gears and he takes on the concept of the high priest. Now, the high priest was the highest position in the Jewish religion. He offered sacrifices on behalf of the people and interceded on behalf of the people before God. He was the people's representative to God, and he was to intercede and to advocate on behalf of the people before God. And chapter 5 addresses the qualifications for the high priest. The high priest would offer sacrifices for the sins of the people and for himself. He was to be sympathetic to the plight of the people. that he was to show compassion on the ignorant and the wayward and those who had made mistakes in life and those who had wrecked their lives. He was to understand their viewpoint and to be able to be compassionate on them and to steer them in the right direction. And he was to be called and qualified by God himself. But in the time that Hebrews was written, the high priest had become a political position. And worse, with Christ having arrived, the high priest refused to step aside and clung on to a position that rightfully belonged to Jesus. Even worse, you'll find in the book of John that it was the high priest who conceived of the plan to have Christ crucified. So in chapter 4, the writer of Hebrews not only makes the case that Jesus is the true high priest, but that he's a superior high priest to any high priest we've ever had before. The writer of Hebrews will make the point that he passed into the heavens and he resides in the presence of God. He is empathetic and understanding of our needs, and therefore we can hold on to our faith and go boldly before him to find grace to help in time of need. The Lord, our high priest, has passed into the heavens and resides in the presence of God. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14, the writer states, "Seeing then that we have a great high priest that has passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession." We have a great high priest, a superb representative who advocates for us before God the Father. He is amazing and he is effective at what he does. And he has passed into the heavens. He is in the presence of God. Don't you want your representative in front of those whom you are petitioning? Wouldn't it be great if your advocate before God actually dwelt in the presence of God and was at his right hand and was speaking on your behalf day in and day out without fail? That's exactly what the writer of Hebrews states that Jesus does, that he has passed into the heavens. Jesus, the Son of God, he is in the presence of the Father. He makes this point again in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. He says, "Wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them." This intercession is his advocacy for us. Christ advocates for us, carrying our requests before God and advocating for what is best for us. And because of this, he is able to secure our salvation. When Hebrews 7:25 says he is able to save them to the uttermost, this means the most saved you can possibly be. And so the writer states in verse 14 here in chapter 4, "Let us hold fast our profession." This is something he will state again in the book of Hebrews. To cling to your faith, to hold fast to your profession, to cling to your faith, to be more centered around your faith, and to let your faith become the core of who you are. You should do this because Christ advocates for you. And with this, we learn that we are to rely on God and not man for spiritual peace and fulfillment. For the Hebrews, they were to quit looking to the high priest and to quit looking to the Old Testament religion and to start looking to Christ. For us, we are to quit being completely dependent on authors, celebrity pastors, and others. We are to quit being dependent on our situation, our jobs, our bosses, and even our families, and we are to start looking to Christ. The writer goes on to make the point that Christ is empathetic and he is understanding of our struggles. In verse 15, he says, "We have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin." The high priest in Jerusalem had become insulated by his political power and no longer had much in common with the people, had very little contact with the people. Therefore, he had very little understanding of what the people were going through. And likewise, our political leaders and elite today can lose touch with our struggles in life. But this verse teaches us that Jesus was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. And you see that word tempted, and you immediately think of temptation like being tempted to sin. And this verse once caused a little stress for one of my former church members. He couldn't fathom Jesus being tempted by sin, even though you see Satan tempting Jesus in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4. He was concerned about the idea of Jesus being tempted. But this word tempted in Hebrews chapter 4 verse 15 doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus was being tempted to sin. It means that he faced the same day-to-day problems and frustrations that we do. Jesus knows how it feels to be hungry, to be tired, to be rejected, to be alone, to have a need and to have that need fulfilled, to be betrayed. He understands all the emotions and situations and trials and tribulations that we go through on a daily basis. He has experienced those. He has been tempted or tested or tried in all ways the same way that we are. And this is what makes the humanity of Christ such a powerful thing. He has lived our life. He knows what it's like. And he has taken that knowledge to heaven, where he uses it as he advocates for us before the Father. Isn't that a wonderful thing to know? And shouldn't that motivate our faith? And so the writer of Hebrews makes the point that we can hold on to our faith and pray confidently when we are in need. In Hebrews 4:14, he says, "Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession." To hold fast means to cling tightly to your profession of faith, your belief, to cling tightly to your belief that is so strong that it impacts the way you live. Because Christ has passed into the heavens and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God, where he ever lives to make intercession for us, you can cling tightly to your faith. And then in verse 16, "Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." To come boldly to the throne of grace means to come to the Lord in prayer, and to come to the Lord in prayer confidently. We can pray with confidence, knowing that Christ is there with the Father, that he has lived our experience and he understands, and that he will advocate for us. And in so doing, we will find the help that we need from the Lord. This is a prayer that we can bring before the Lord directly. While it is good to ask others to pray for you, you do not need a preacher, priest, clergy, or any other guru to be the mediator between you and God. Jesus fills that role for you. How amazing is the Lord's love for us, that he was willing to go through what we go through so he could better redeem us and advocate for us before the Father. This is Ancient Scrolling. I'm Leland Acker.